Hi, everybody, and welcome back to JenTalks. This is part 3 of a 3-part series introducing trauma and how the trauma affects the physical and the mental and emotional part of us as we are changed by trauma. And just to recap, I always remind people, because people really struggle with that word trauma, that trauma is not the story of what happened to you. It's what's left behind. It's the aftermath of what has happened to you, if you like to think of it like that, or the shadow, the pain that's left behind. So for some people, changing schools at a very young age can be trauma, and for other people, it can be a lot more severe and a lot more serious. It can be a lot more, we say regular. It can happen on a regular basis. So realistically, when you're looking at your own life and analyzing it, it's not so much, whether you have acute trauma or chronic trauma or any of those categories. It's just to understand that when we experience trauma, as many of us have, it changes particularly our brain. And when our brain is different, obviously our behavior and the way we live our lives differs too. And we talked very much in part 1 about all of those changes. So if this is new to you, if you're watching this for the first time without catching part 1 and part 2, it could be worth looking back on part 1. It's on my YouTube channel if you're watching this somewhere else. So look up part 1 of part 3 on trauma. It talks about the changes to the brain. And what I'd like to do is, I suppose, to incorporate some of that information around the changes to the brain today, and to also kind of give you a visual of what it is I'm talking about. So let's talk about the 4 changes that we mentioned in week 1. And we talked about how the amygdala, which is the animal part of the brain, it's often referred to as the reptile part of the brain because it's our prehistoric brain. It's the very first part of our brain that was formed as human beings. That's larger in a brain that has experienced trauma. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you in a moment. We also have the hippocampus, which is responsible for, one of its functions is responsible for emotional regulation. And that has bigger connections with the amygdala. So they talk to each other more often than they would from a non-trauma exposed brain. We have the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain, and that shrinks actually in a trauma brain. And also it makes it more difficult for this part of the brain to focus. So if you've experienced trauma, you may struggle to stay focused. And then, of course, the whole of the central nervous system is in overdrive. So it's overstimulated. And that is absolutely exhausting because we're constantly in fight or flight response. So we have high alert, we catastrophize easier, we're affected by life's challenges more easily, we live more strongly in fear than we are out of fear, and high levels of anxiety. So I just want to demonstrate, I suppose, to give you a visual about what that might feel like or look like, that you could maybe possibly relate to, and then talk about how to soothe it. So I want you to imagine, I'm using the Dansigal model of the human brain. So this is our brain. So you can imagine this is our prefrontal cortex. This is our vagus nerve down here. And inside our brain, we have our little prehistoric creature. So in this case, I'm just going to use a finger puppet to demonstrate that. There's our model of our brain. And that's our animal brain, which is often referred to as the amygdala. And when this guy is running the show, the amygdala is only responsible for reacting, for emotional reaction. He has a non-thinking part of the brain. So when the amygdala is running the show, we cannot think. That's why sometimes when we have a really outburst of anger, maybe we're in a row with somebody, afterwards you say, I don't remember what they said, or I don't remember what I said myself, because we don't have access to our logical thinking brain when this little guy is running the show. Now, so you think that's bad. When you have a trauma-informed brain that's been exposed to chronic or acute trauma, over the years, the amygdala is no longer this little guy that we can kind of tuck away, which I'm going to show you how to do in a moment, put back to bed. We have this guy running the show. So this guy, as you can see, there's quite a difference in size there. The amygdala is larger in the brain that has been exposed and is suffering from trauma. So if you think about me now trying to put this little guy back into the bed the same way I did a moment ago, it's not quite as easy. He's still sticking out, isn't he? He's still protruding. You can still visible. he's probably still affected on what's going on in the mind. So what we need to do is we need to look at both of these. We need to look at both of these little animals and think about our animal brain. Regardless of whether you have a larger amygdala or a regular size amygdala, a standard size amygdala, they both are put back to bed in the same way, which I'm going to show you now in a moment. The other thing to think about is both of these, depending on which one you have, are both a part of you. So it's not a case to kind of detach from this part of you and just as if it doesn't, as if it doesn't belong to you. It's as much a part of you as your hippocampus and your prefrontal cortex and anything else that belongs to your biological body. So it's about getting to know your animal brain, and it's also about nurturing it and also being aware of when it starts to run the show and when it comes out to play. If you want to learn, I suppose, read up a little bit more about that, one of my favorite books that kind of describes us in this format is The Chimp Paradox. And he talks about how we have a human brain and an animal brain. So it's well worth looking up if that's something that interests you. And then his second book, and the reason why I'm pausing here is I'm trying to think of his name. It's Professor James something. I'll post it on the channel later when I think of it, because I'm not going to think of it now under pressure. He also has a second book called The Path Through the Jungle, and that describes not just the chimp or animal brain. He talks about the tools to overcome it. And again, it's all about self-awareness, and it's all about getting to know these little animal brains. So this is what happens, as we talked about earlier on, when the animal brain becomes activated. So there's the model of our brain, and we're going around minding our own business, and all of a sudden something happens that triggers us. And we don't have predetermined strategies in place to help us with this. So we react. So we've all been there. We've had a little outburst. We've had a little reaction, and out pops our animal brain. Okay. Now, when that happens, what you didn't quite mightn't have spotted there is, in order for that to happen, this part of the brain lifts away, and that's the prefrontal cortex, and that's the thinking part of the brain. So that's just disappeared. As Dan Segal would say, that actually is known as flipping your lid. So we're no longer in thinking mode. We're just in absolute rampage mode. We're on the rampage, where we're non-thinking, we're roaring and shouting, or we're in panic. We might be in fight or flight, we might be in freeze response, but there's nothing valuable happening in this moment apart from a rampage going on. And when we go into panic, we can't think, and we can't think for ourselves. We can't think rationally. So in order for us to start to think rationally and to start to process what's going on and to come up with solutions, we need to put this animal brain back to bed for a moment until we can gather our thoughts and get back to ourselves. And the best way to get this little animal brain, one of the best ways, I'm sure everybody has their own different ways, one of the best ways that I know, of course, is to breathe. And we know this because when we were younger, your parents might say, or your adults in charge might say, hold on, calm down, take a deep breath and count to 10. So when we can breathe nice and slowly, we're going to slow down the nervous system. And the more slow the nervous system is responding, the quicker this little animal goes back to bed. Okay, so he's taking him back to bed. But if your animal brain is that bigger and it's very difficult to get him back into bed, what we need to do also, on top of putting him into bed in the moment, is to do an activity that soothes the central nervous system on a daily basis. So yes, it's powerful to do it when we are in meltdown or outbursts or carnage. It's absolutely powerful to try to implement some of the breathing techniques or any of the other techniques that I'm going to mention in a moment. But also consistency is key. Small little habits every single day that can help towards our well-being and help to maintain our relationship with our rest and digest. So think about it. Think about this little animal brain as being a little fur baby, and you want to look after it as best you can. The same way you'd put the baby down for sleep throughout the day. We also want to make sure that this little fur baby is getting plenty of rest. So what we do is we do our breathing ideally at least once a day, first thing in the morning. It doesn't have to be first thing in the morning. That's just what I do because that's my best time. Maybe later on, lunchtime, in the afternoon, and possibly again at night. So that's what I do to to keep my little fur baby well rested and tucked up in bed so that he's not running the show on a regular basis. And also, if I have a larger amygdala, it helps to reduce the amygdala down. So it shrinks back down to the size that fits nicely in the palm of my hand and goes back to sleep nice and peacefully. So he's not sticking out and intruding into my life. The other things that we have, of course, I've mentioned breath. And as you know, there's videos for breathing exercises on my channel. So if you need any support with that, just click on any of the videos and watch them. The other ones that we have that really work towards activating our rest and digest is mindfulness. And I've mentioned mindfulness more than once. I mentioned it on the talk on part 2 as well. We also have, exercise is really powerful for slow activating our rest and digest, not immediately when we're in exercise because we're often in the stress response, but it's the aftermath of exercise where the heart rate lowers and we get all the beautiful endorphins that are released from exercise. Walking in nature, doing things that bring you absolute joy, so if it's fishing, if it's a hobby, if it's something that puts you into flow, which is where time just passes you by without ever having to think, and that's activates the rest and digest. Yoga, qigong, anything that really just slows down the breathing and allows us to pause and slow down. So think about what you can be doing to nurture your little fur baby. To if he's larger than life, if he's larger than the average amygdala, if you think you're relating to this little chimp, more so than this one, well then make sure you're doing something daily to reduce the size of your amygdala. And then also then what you're doing is you're building habits, you're building codes into the chimp that when things go wrong, the immediate default is not going on the rampage. It can be just a more slower responsive action. It actually builds what we call mental fitness. So well over my 10 minutes today, guys, but that's just because I really wanted to introduce this little kind of tool to you. This is an amazing tool to show children, where they're losing their ability to control their own emotional outbursts, to talk to them about that little part of their brain that's sometimes running the show and teach them how to breathe nice and slowly and deeply into the amygdala so that we can actually soothe our fur baby and put him back to bed. Feel free to post any comments or any questions that you might have or contact me directly. I'm always ready to respond, and I shall be back here next week with some more amazing tools and wisdom around positive mental well-being, physical well-being and emotional health. And thank you again, as always, for joining me here on JenTalks. And I look forward to connecting with you again next week. Have a great week and I'll talk to you all again very soon.